Standing Through the Storms by David Vanderflyer. Chapter 1. 9 p.m., November the 8th, 1997. On board the
HIJACKING
Navigator, 12-hour sail south of Acapulco, Mexico. It was a clear night on a calm sea as we headed south. We had left Acapulco that morning, trying to get out of the way of a tropical disturbance that was forecast to possibly strengthen and come into Acapulco the next day. My wife Ingrid came into the pilot house where I was at the helm running the boat. After a few minutes visiting, I saw that she was looking forward out the window, peering into the darkness. Noticing her focus, I looked out into the darkness in front of us. That's when I first noticed it. A dark squall line laying across our path in the distance. This wasn't too unusual at sea. Experience told me we would most likely just punch on through it and be out on the other side in 15 to 20 minutes. High winds with blowing rain, nasty waves, and perhaps a little lightning, and then out on the other side. But it wasn't to be. At 8 a.m. the next morning we were still in it, and it was clearly more than the usual squall line. It now was blowing at about 35 knots. We crossed past with a Mexican Navy frigate, visible through the rain and ocean spray, whose captain told us the tropical disturbance had developed into Hurricane Rick. They ordered us to Puerto Escondido to take shelter. The brunt of the storm was forecast to hit Acapulco. When we got to Escondido at 4 p.m., the place was abandoned with an ominous swell rolling in. It didn't look good. I radioed the port captain, who told me to get out now. The storm track had changed, and the eye was coming directly at us and was expected to hit where we were in the next few hours. They were forecasting 30-foot seas breaking in the harbor entrance. By the time we got out of there, the wind was blowing 50 knots and heading to 60. As we left Escondido, I remember thinking this was a bad idea. I should have offloaded my family and crew in Escondido. In hindsight, I should have not listened to the Mexican frigate's captain. If I had just carried on south rather than spending 8 hours detouring to Escondido, I would be well south by now and out of this storm's way. Now I was in a real mess. The seas were growing dramatically, and we were trying to claw our way offshore to get some sea room in which to fight. The crew was trying to tie everything down as the storm continued to strengthen. While pulling out of Escondido, the crew had been busy preparing the boat for all-out storm conditions. While securing some full fuel drums on deck, one broke loose, rolling over Darren as it tried to make its escape. Then a 10-foot inflatable on the deck broke loose, flying behind the boat like a kite on a string. Ingrid came to me asking how they should get control of it and re-secure it. I told her to cut the line to set it free and to get all the crew into the pilot house. At that moment, everyone realized we were now fighting for our lives, not equipment. The winds rose through 70 to 80 knots and kept climbing. The seas became immense and confused, and then the wind started to swing as things got worse. It was clear to me that the eye wall was sucking us into the storm. We were in a nightmare. The winds continued to rise, growing to 120 knots over the deck when coming out of the wave troughs into the clean wind above the waves. Seas became massive walls of steep breaking water from multiple directions in total confusion, with some waves reaching over 35 feet, towering over us. Some monster waves were simply beyond comprehension in size. The noise the wind made was like a freight train rolling through your house. It was truly beyond belief. As the storm raged, we were all locked into the pilot house together. There were 7 of us, including my 2 6-year-old children. Every pump we had was running, trying to keep up with the water that was getting in. Water was getting in because we were playing submarine, with the pilot house windows submerging each time we crashed into the bottom of a trough. The boat was truly well built, with steel rods running through the pilot house frame down into the hull. These rods plus half-inch thick windows kept the pilot house from being torn off the boat. All the high water alarms were flashing, meaning that we had thousands of gallons of water sloshing in the bilges. The main pumps were struggling because of debris that was being sucked into them. The debris had gotten into the bilges as a result of the wild rolls we were taking onto our sides. I figured our life expectancy was down to a few minutes, and then we would soon capsize. Then it got dark. What was I doing here? Had God brought me through all that He had simply to kill me and my family here alone at sea? If we went down, it would not be survivable. The boat would broach and roll over. It would be chaos. Our life rafts would not survive in these conditions with breaking walls of water, even if we were able to get to them. My prayers were not so much to survive the storm, but rather to take us quickly if we went down. The prospect of death didn't scare me. I knew I was God's, but I could not bear the thought of watching or hearing my children's cries as the scene claimed us. How did I get here? Well, the answer was really quite simple. It was God's fault. There was a time in my life, most of my life for that matter, that I didn't know God, but He chose to call me, and it was Him that had brought me into this storm. This is my story, but really, it's God's story, and it started years ago before I knew Him. Chapter 2, Beginnings. John 6, verse 44. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws them, and I will raise them up at that last day. Some people say that Christians are boring, that they have no fun or excitement in their lives, that there are too many rules to enjoy life. I suppose for some that might be the case, but I don't see the Bible as a rule book, and I have seen people from all segments of society living lives that bring little joy, or as Thoreau said, living lives of quiet desperation. My experience as a follower of Christ tells me that life is an adventure. That's because as a follower of Christ, you go where He leads you. You walk where He walks. And if you have ever read the Bible, you will know that Jesus and His 12 lived life on the edge. There is, however, a difference between being a follower and being a believer. A believer is content to sit and believe, whereas a follower must do just that, get up and follow. This is my story. It's a story of adventure, and it's a story of faith, because without faith, it is impossible to follow. And without following, it is impossible to see God's truth. As with Jesus' walk on this earth, parts of it may make you laugh as He laughed, and parts of it may make you cry as He cried. Every story has a beginning, so that's where I'll start. A Christian is not born as a Christian. I believe that faith begins when God's Spirit begins to pull on your heartstrings. You have a choice. You can listen or you can walk away. Sometimes it's pain that makes you stop, listen, and wonder. That's where my story begins. I got married in the summer of 1982. Nancy and I lived in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, where I worked for an agricultural lobby organization. After only a few short months of marriage, Nancy became ill very suddenly one evening near the end of that November and was in great pain. We went to the ER at the hospital in Victoria, and by the end of the evening, we were given devastating news. Nancy was diagnosed with leukemia. She had a white blood cell count of near 0, and her pain was from infections that had come as a result. Within a day or two, we headed to Vancouver General Hospital, where the province's main leukemia treatment center was located. Things went poorly from the beginning. Nancy was horribly sick from the chemo right from the start. By Christmas, the test showed we were making no progress with the leukemia. Late Christmas Eve, she was taken into the emergency surgery, and her spleen was removed due to a massive infection. The next week, things went from bad to worse. Late on New Year's Eve, they took her in for emergency surgery again and removed a large section of her intestines that was infected. After surgery, she was moved directly to the ICU and put on a respirator due to infections in her lungs that were not allowing her to get enough oxygen. She stayed in the ICU on the respirator until the end. On January 14, the doctors told me the battle was lost. There was nothing more they could do. Her organs were slowly shutting down, and the leukemia had worsened. They recommended unplugging the respirator. We did that at noon that day. Nancy's family was devastated and unable to cope with the realities of watching their daughter die. So that afternoon, I sat with Nancy alone as her breathing slowly slowed and her heart rate steadily dropped as the hours went by. She died 15 days before her 26th birthday, 6 months after our wedding and a 6-week fight. Her death hit me at my core. I remember Nancy's dad saying she was in heaven, and it occurred to me that if there was a heaven, the reality was that Nancy had no belief system or lifestyle that would have gotten her there. If the place did exist, it left me questioning things. During Nancy's battle, I was approached by a newly forming agricultural marketing organization that wanted to hire me to run the organization. I had worked closely with the industry as part of my job in Victoria, and they knew what I was going through, but needed me to start ASAP. I accepted the job as general manager of the organization, and a week later moved from Victoria to Abbotsford and started my new job. Perhaps change and staying busy would get me through this dark period. The marketing organization was in its startup and was in complete chaos when I started the job. I was working 16 hours a day, along with a team that was put together to get through this transition period. I met Ingrid at this point. She was one of those employees that worked hard until the job was done. She was part of the team that got the system up and running through sheer determination. Over the first few months, we spent a lot of time working long hours together with the team and came to know each other well. At work, I reported to a board of directors, all of whom were agricultural producers from around the province. Many of them were solid Christians. This was a new experience for me. I spent huge amounts of time with these guys working and traveling around the country and province, and came to know and trust them. Time went by, and Ingrid and I got to know each other pretty well. Ingrid was born in Brazil and raised in a Christian home with Mennonite roots. She had just gone through a divorce and as a result had stepped away from her church. She was a mess, and I was a mess, and with time it went from long work hours to becoming a couple. and she moved in with me. We were both probably pretty dysfunctional at this point in our lives. I had a 29-foot sailboat in those days, and Ingrid took to sailing well. In fact, on her first weekend on the boat, she steered the boat in near gale force winds while I was unjamming some gear on the bow. What can I say? She was a keeper. But she was also an employee. I went to my board to inform them of our relationship status. They all knew Ingrid well and recognized her value as an employer and approved her continued employment, though the Christian base within them struggled with the living together part of it. Ben was one of the board members that I knew the best. He lived a few miles from the office and owned a large hog farm. During my time working there, Ben was vice chairman for part of the time and then became chairman. We had a very close relationship and spent many a day traveling and working together. Ben was a Christian with Mennonite background who lived his faith. During this time period, on a drive to Vancouver for a meeting, Ben talked to me about his beliefs, and we got into a discussion which Ben finally brought around to my lifestyle. Ben was clear that he struggled with my choices. I remember him saying that regardless of what I did and how I lived, he would always be my friend, but he also shared with me that he believed my lifestyle was just wrong and I would lead to nothing good. I admired Ben for his honesty as a friend, but carried on as before. As time went by, Ingrid and I got married, built a nice house on a mountainside, sailed away every weekend, and went to Hawaii for 2 or 3 weeks every winter. In spite of all this, Ingrid became miserable. It became clear that she was struggling with the faith that she had walked away from. She needed to reconcile with her beliefs, and I think we both felt that if the marriage was to survive, she would have to get back into church. I told her if she wanted to go back to church, I was willing to go with her. I had never been involved with a church before, other than the standard Christmas and Easter thing when I was much younger, and it was not something I relished doing. I had no wish to go to Ingrid's former church, as there was too much history there. And culturally, it was a German-speaking church, with many of its congregation having come from Brazil and Paraguay. It would not be a place I would easily fit into. Ben had often talked of his church, and if the people in his church were at all like him, I believed that we would be accepted there for who we were. We started attending there, and even though it was a big church, it was very friendly. It turned out that the senior pastor lived around the corner from us. We became friends and spent time with him. He began a Bible study at his home and invited us to come. He had gathered a group of people together who had all been through stuff, drug issues, messed up homes, divorce, and pain. It was a group of misfits, not what people would think of as normal Christians. It was a good group of people, and in this environment, Pastor Herb began to teach about Jesus. He gave a completely different view of him than I had ever been exposed to, and I became curious. We started hanging with church people more, and people kept trying to tell me what the Bible said. What they said didn't always make sense. So one summer, on a 4-week sailing trip around Vancouver Island, I took the Bible with me as my only book to read, and read it cover to cover while on the boat to see what it really said. When I read the Bible from beginning to end, it all made sense to me. As a whole, it painted a totally logical picture that simply rang true. I also learned that many Christians simply don't have a clue what the Bible actually says and believed what people said it said rather than actually reading it themselves. Based on what I read, I began to be convinced and understand it as truth. Life went on, and after 7 years in Abbotsford, we moved to Vernon, in the interior of British Columbia, for a different job. We went to a large church there, and most of our new friends were from church. I continued to grow in my belief that what I was reading was true, but it did not really change my life. I had friends who were vocal and excited about their faith, whereas I was quiet and not greatly affected by it. My faith or beliefs did nothing to change who I was. I started talking, praying to God, beginning to question if He really existed. I was getting frustrated and was ready to give up and walk away from it all when it all changed. One evening at Bible study, I was quietly arguing with God, trying to make sense of things. Suddenly it felt like I wasn't alone in my thoughts. An inner voice in my head, this is where you begin to think I may be nuts, but read on, was telling me to read a selection of books in the Bible, all of them written by John. I stayed up late that night reading. When I got up in the morning, I had changed. I was never the same person again after that night. It amazes me that you can read and reread the Bible time after time and get something new from it each time. As I had reread the books written by John, it was like God spoke to me, opening up a new world of understanding. I learned what love was that night and realized for my entire life I had never really had a clue what love was about. It changed my world. Time went by and I grew rapidly in my faith, and then something happened that changed my world again.
Chapter 3.
Getting ready. John 12, verse 26. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, my servant also will be. My Father will honor the one who serves me. Let me start this off by saying this. In my experience, God has a tremendous sense of humor. I believe He likes to have a good chuckle. I'd always thought that some of the crazy stuff you hear about dreams and visions was simply that, crazy stuff. I always find this part difficult to explain, so I will just tell it this way, that it happened, and let you sort it out. The proof of it all comes later anyway. Time had passed since that night that I had sat up reading John's letters and discovered love. I had become a deacon at my church and co-leader of a large Bible study. I owned and ran my own financial services company. It was late in the day and all my staff were gone. I was working at my office computer, talking to God as I worked, when it felt like someone got inside my head and was directing my thoughts, talking to me, and showing me images at rapid speed in my mind. It was like God came to introduce Himself, showing me visual and audio in my mind. Scenes from the Bible explaining why and what, images of what was to come in the near and not so near future, all in living color and at times very terrifying. I have no idea how long it went on, but by the end I was exhausted and a bit of shock. In addition to the rather frightening images that flashed through my mind, God's Spirit was showing me that He had plans for my life and went about showing me what He was calling me to do. I know it sounds crazy, but in the coming months and years, God would prove to me and others the truth of it all. One part of what I saw sticks so vividly in my mind. I recognize it as a living part of the book of Revelation, chapter 6, verse 9, the fifth seal of the seven seals. I saw an altar, incredible to look at with its ornate gold work overlaid on what I can only describe as a brilliant white material that literally shone with its own brightness. As it was shown to me, a hand and arm reached out and pulled the top of the altar open. I looked into a very large space, full of what I can best describe as ghost-like or spirit-like people. They were opaque, semi-transparent, ghost-like beings that were recognizable as people, but they had no solid bodies. I recognized them as the spirits or souls of those who had died as martyrs for Christ. They were all looking up at me, hollering loudly, "How much longer must we wait?" These souls had died for Christ and gone to what Christ told the thief on the cross was paradise. They knew that at the end of time of tribulation, they would receive their resurrected bodies. They also knew that the tribulation would not begin until the gospel had been preached to all the world. These souls were waiting for the believers on earth to do their job under Christ's great commission, taking the gospel into all the world. I was being called into missions, but in a way that would involve numerous other mission organizations and expose people from our North American culture to a world mission viewpoint and the needs of the mission environment. In summary of all the episodes, we were to sell all we had, buy a boat, and go to serve in mission work. It was clear that this would be our life for 7 years. It was also clear that much of our wealth we were to invest and how the rest of funding would come. It was all rather frightening and exciting. Ingrid was a trooper. She had seen the changes in my life, and a result of seeing what I had become, she had total trust in what was happening. After all this had occurred, I had an understanding of what we were to do, but I did not know where. I began to share what had happened with a few people. Ingrid's brother Will and his wife Betty, whom we told. I also sat down and talked with the senior pastor at our church. He was very supportive and became a major ally in our challenge. I then talked to our Bible study group, who would become involved, supporting our work by serving us on the home front while we were gone. Ingrid and I was sitting in our living room with Will and Betty one evening talking about what God had shown me and what was missing or unknown. I knew we would be in a boat. I knew we were to gain a grip on Spanish and then French. I had seen images of where we would be, but not told where it was. It was Will who suddenly, somehow, knew the answer. He looked at me like the lights had just come on and said, "It's Haiti. You're going to Haiti." After some research on Haiti and praying about it, it became clear that Will was right. We were going to Haiti. I knew nothing of Haiti at this point, but I knew I was being called to go there. So we bought tickets, off we flew to Haiti. Me, Ingrid, and our 2 4-year-old children. Looking out the window on final approach, I was in shock. This had to be a mistake. Leaving the airport was terrifying. You don't know what poor is until you have walked the streets of Port-au-Prince as it was in 1995. Haiti was in chaos. A dictator who had seized power in a coup, been forced from office by way of a mandated international embargo. The already broken country had been brought to its knees. The UN trying to run things and organize new elections. In those first few hours, I saw people lying in the gutters, starving and unable to move. I watched as a starving man was beaten to death by a crowd with sugarcane sticks for stealing a handful of rice in the streets. Each day we ventured further afield, and the picture got worse and worse. I did not want to get on a boat, sail to Haiti, and live there. The last week we were there, we went out on a mission operation near on the coast. Ingrid and I had met some representatives of the organization in Vancouver when attending a Mission Fest conference. While spending time at their base in Haiti, I sat down with the founder, Pastor George, and explained to him exactly what happened and what I felt I was being called to do. He started laughing and then explained his behavior. He had a few other pastors praying to God that he would send someone to fill a specific need. He said God was calling us to Haiti to do exactly what he had been praying for. Pastor George and that mission were to become a major part of our lives in the coming years. During that last week in Haiti, it was clear, both to Ingrid and me, that what God was calling us to do would be difficult, but possible. It was just all rather overwhelming, and God would have to show up. Over the next year and a half, we raised the money, put together crews, and sold all we had. Before we could do this, however, we needed to find a boat and organize a million things. After our return from Haiti, and having made the decision to pursue the mission part before us, we began to search for a boat. I had earned my first sailing badge at the age of 11, and since finishing university, I had owned and sailed sailboats. In the back of my mind, I had a desire to travel by sailboat at some point in my life. I always had the Southern Pacific as a goal, doing research since my university days on boat designs, long-distance sailing systems, and storm survival techniques at sea. This gained knowledge was useful in that I knew what to look for in a boat, and the task of traveling by sea did not overly concern me. In fact, the voyage part of the task in front of me was like God giving me the desires of my heart. It was the rest of it that scared me. When it came time to look for a boat to travel long distances at sea, the only thing that made sense to me was a sailboat. Finding a sailboat that had the capacity for carrying material and guests and was within our price range was a challenge. The first boat we pursued was a 65-foot ketch. It was a massive boat with a ferro cement hull. The fact that it was ferro cement kept its price down, but the hull did not bother me, as I had been researching them for years as a personal option and knew what to look for. This hull was well made and solid. Whenever we put an offer in on a boat, we prayed the same prayer: Lord, do not let us buy this boat if it is not the right one. I guess this was not the right boat because the owner called me back saying that the offer was good, but they had changed their minds. The boat was no longer for sale. The next boat we looked at was a 60-foot steel ketch. It was a solid boat with a gorgeous interior. I would have preferred it to be a few feet longer and a few dollars less, but I believed it to be a workable option. It was listed by a broker, and I discussed the price with him. From previous offers, the broker was pretty sure what it would take to make a deal. We put in a good offer, said our prayer, and waited for a reply. The broker called back the next day. He was frustrated. The owner told him that it was a good offer, but that he had changed his mind. Once again, the boat was no longer for sale. Having made two good offers on boats with both owners pulling the boats off the market, we were frustrated, but had to assume that our prayer was being answered and that we had not yet found the right boat. A few weeks later, I was at the bank taking care of some business. A friend I knew from the local yacht club worked there, and she approached me with a boat magazine in hand, opened it to the classified section. She knew I was looking for a sailboat, but suggested I look at a boat she had just come across in the magazine. The boat was a 75-foot twin diesel ex-Navy boat moored in Maple Bay on Vancouver Island. It was more boat than I had in mind, but I had a good friend who lived not too far from there. I called him, and he agreed to look at it and call me. After seeing this boat, he was absolutely convinced this was the one. It was a long way from Vernon where we lived, but we drove the 6 hours to the coast, caught the ferry for the 2-hour sail to the island, and drove an hour to the boat. It had snowed, and there were 6 inches of snow on the boat, and it was cold and damp. The boat was too big. It was not a sailboat. It was made of wood, and it was old, having been built in 1954. My list of concerns was long, but in my heart, I knew this was the boat. There were no luxuries on this boat. Built like a tank, it was a workboat through and through. The thought of running a boat of this size and weight concerned me. I had owned my own sailboats, had sailed for years, and had chartered and skippered large sailboats in the Bahamas. This boat, however, was more like a small ship, and that concerned me. We went home, said our standard prayer, and put it in an offer. After several back and forth offers and counter-offers, the deal was made. The boat was hauled out and inspected thoroughly, and the deal was closed. Part of our agreement was a 4-day cruise with the owner. As I have said, this boat was like a small ship rather than a boat. It had many complicated mechanical and electrical systems to figure out, and I needed to be able to handle and maneuver the boat in a very close quarters when bringing it into a dock. At 75 feet and 80 tons, you didn't have to hit another boat to damage it. You simply had to touch it. When docking smaller sailboats, you could just jump off and fend the boat off the dock. At 80 tons, you needed to be in complete control as you eased it in. I had 4 days to learn everything about the boat. It was a steep learning curve. By the time we began our voyage south, I would be an expert in all things relating to the boat. So having found this large twin diesel boat, I now wondered why. The sailboats I liked would take my family in smaller groups of 4 or 5 comfortably, 6 in a pinch, and they would sail and burn far less fuel, making them cheaper to run. This boat, I felt clearly led to buy, could house my family and still easily have room for 12 more people. It could also carry about 25 tons of material if loaded properly. My record load was 58,000 pounds, or 29 tons. Clearly, if this was the right boat, then God had something bigger in mind than I had considered. Time would tell. We had spent the 4 days with the previous owner cruising the islands and had acquired more info in my head than it wanted to hold. Let me tell you, the first time I brought that boat into the Point Roberts Marina, we would keep the boat until leaving for Haiti. Alone, I was terrified. Hit the horn to tell other boats that a large vessel was coming into the narrow channel. Come into the channel and pass by our moorage spot. Sound the horn again to tell other boats around me that I was going into reverse in mid-channel to come to a stop. Once the turn was complete, with the bow aimed back at the dock, then throttle both motors slow ahead with wheel hard to port. The boat would stand in place as it spun slowly on its center, adjusting starboard and port throttles to keep from sliding backwards or forward. With other boats moored on the end slips, I had less than 10 feet in front of me and behind me when doing this. That's fine if there's no wind. Wind meant more throttle on both engines to spin faster. Once the turn was complete, with the bow aimed back at the dock, then throttle both motors slow ahead with rudders amidships. As you approach the dock at an angle, the stern must swing into the dock while making sure the bow does not hit it. So on final approach, rudder stays amidships. Both motors go to neutral, and at just the right moment, the starboard motor
goes to hard reverse, stopping the boat while at the same time throwing the stern in towards the dock. If done just right, you have successfully stopped the boat parallel to and 6 to 12 inches from the dock. Sounds easy enough, and I can still do the move in my mind. It becomes an art. There is no room for error. 75 feet and 80 tons can crush a small sailboat at the dock faster than you can think about it. Maybe a little fear was good. It kept me from being stupid. The Navy had sold the boat to the fellow we bought it from, but leased it back for reserve and Navy cadet training exercises on numerous occasions. The Navy was restructuring and canceling any new lease contracts, which is why the boat had been for sale. However, there were still some outstanding contracts with the Navy that needed fulfilling. I had agreed that we would honor these contracts, and as it turned out, we made good money doing it and gained some invaluable experience at the same time. For the first one, I delivered the boat to the Esquimalt Navy base next to Victoria, BC. There was my boat and 2 sister boats owned by the Navy. The boats were very similar, except that my boat had nicer rebuilt accommodations. The Navy was taking sea cadets out for 3 days of training, and they needed our boat because they had more cadets than room on available boats. When they chartered the boat, I came with it as captain. Each of the other boats had a Navy officer in command, but I was not Navy. They solved this by putting a fleet commander on my boat, who was in charge of the whole wake end. So what did we do for 3 days? We ran drills, fire drills, flood emergency pump drills, man overboard drills. They drilled, and that fleet commander made sure that by the time we were done, I could do anything in that boat. My favorite was the man overboard drill. We had a floating dummy in the pilot house, and when the crew was distracted by something, the dummy would be flung out the window in the boathouse. Cadets were on watch at different stations around the boat, and the rear watch should be able to spot the dummy in the water. The drill began when the man overboard was called by the watch. What happened next was the opposite of what you may expect. Instead of slowing and turning, the boat was ordered to full speed ahead away from the dummy in the water. After being at full throttle for half a minute, an emergency Williamson turn was ordered. At full throttle, the wheel was ordered to full hard port rudder left. As the boat reached 45 degrees turned, the order was given for hard starboard rudder and hard reverse starboard right motor. With the boat now running at full speed and the rudder hard over, the boat took on tremendous lean as the stern literally slid sideways in the turn because of the one motor in full reverse. As the boat came around, you could see a clear white wake line in the water caused by the propellers churning up the water by having gone to full throttle away from the victim, who you could now see at the end of that churned up wake line. The reverse in mid-turn caused the boat to turn so quickly that we were aimed directly down our wake line. It was then back to full ahead throttle to get back to the dummy, followed by a hard reverse to stop. While this was happening, the rest of the crew was preparing for recovery, and as we stopped by the dummy, the Zodiac was being swung out on the crane with crew aboard to recover the dummy. Total recovery time was usually around 3 minutes. By the end of the weekend, I had come a long way in being able to make the boat do whatever I needed it to do, thanks to that fleet commander who took it upon himself to train me and ensure that I was qualified to run and maneuver that boat. By the time I finished the Navy contracts, I was confident that I knew how to handle the boat. Now, God has a sense of humor, but he is also good at showing he is with you when you follow his lead. There are many examples of how God would do something to clearly show He was with us. Here was one example that happened at the Navy lease weekend. Tucked in beside the many yachts docked on the edge of Stanley Park in Vancouver, there is a small Navy Reserve dock. It was about a 4-hour trip to get there from the marina. When pulling up to the dock, I was very glad that I had received the training from the fleet commander during the previous lease. Amid the many mega yachts docked there, I had to do a standing turn, spinning the boat around in my place. My boat was 75 feet long, and I had only 80 feet of space between very expensive yachts to pull off the maneuver. While tied to the dock, waiting for the group of cadets to arrive, there was a loud knocking on the hull. I went out to find a 6-foot 6-inch Coast Guard officer pounding on the boat's hull. He demanded to know why I had this boat. I explained the weekend training to him, but he was irate and said he knew this. What he wanted to do was why I had bought the boat. I invited him in for a cup of coffee and told him why I had bought the boat. He began crying quietly as I told my story. He explained that he was a Christian and that he was driving by the boat. An audible voice told him to stop and asked the owner of the ex-Navy boat why he had bought it. He said it had never happened to him before, but that he knew it was the Holy Spirit telling him to do it. He said he had argued with God because the whole thing seemed crazy, but in the end he obeyed. He said he was so loud and irritable because he was uncomfortable and didn't understand why God was telling him to do this. He came back to the boat at the end of the weekend and helped bring the boat back to Point Roberts with me. Over that year and a half, others came up to us, looking confused, but telling us that they had been told to bring a message to us. As crazy as it all sounds, there was always something in what they said each time that we needed to hear. It was like God needed us to know that we knew what we were doing. In the times ahead, we would need the certainty with the things we would face. When we brought the Tikhonir, we had an issue with the layout of the cabins. The Navy had the boat set up for officers in the forward cabin and the rest of the crew in the back cabins. We thought about using the forward quarters as Ingrid's and my cabin, but the problem with this was that the children were still young and would be too far away in the back cabins. Ingrid and I using the forward cabin would also restrict our privacy with groups on board. If we used one of the back cabins, it would be a problem with space for guests. So, as big as the boat was, the decision was made to do some renovations. After a lot of thought and discussion, we built an additional cabin on the back deck. This provided the boat with a proper captain's quarters. It gave us a room on deck level, which helped with boat security. It provided a room that connected directly to our children's and gave us a private space when we had guests on board. The design also gave us a covered aft deck and a beam structure that extended 2 feet out over the stern. This allowed us to install a swim grid and boarding ladder on the stern, folded upward while at sea, plus provided a system for hanging the tender, dinghy, off the stern. Loading people was far easier and safer via a swim grid than to try to scramble up the side of the boat, especially in a choppy anchorage. This whole addition to the boat made the back section of the boat far more functional. This work was done at the dock in the Point Roberts Marina during the winter and early spring of the year we left. The entire structure was built to survive anything the weather and ocean could throw at it. In addition to getting the boat ready for its work in Haiti, we had to organize the legal structure behind the whole operation. As we were getting organized, our church in Vernon helped us out by running donations to us through their books until we could get our own charitable status set up. We needed a legal structure, a board of directors to govern it, and a name for it. Once that was all together, we would need to apply to Revenue Canada for charitable tax status. We were part of a good-sized Bible study group. Members had a variety of talents. Under Canadian law, I could not be a member of the board as I received a benefit from the organization. I would be living on the boat. So I wanted to get people on the board that had certain skills and that were wise counselors. Tuck was a friend and member of our Bible study who was calm and wise and ran his own business. He became chairman/president of the board. Barb, who was also part of the Bible study, was an accountant. She was also our treasurer. Todd was a businessman and hands-on guy who would not hesitate to call me on it if I were ever to start behaving poorly. Roy was a mechanic and very hands-on and practical assistance. Will was Ingrid's brother. He was working to become a pastor, and he was family. He would always have our best interests at heart. This group of people ran our world and advised us with wise counsel. Without them back home, we could not have accomplished what we did. Tuck came up with our name, Caribbean Maritime Outreach Missions, or as we became known,
CMOM.